when a Los Angeles Superior Court judge mockingly laughed at Keanu Reeves during what seemed like a routine property dispute, he had no idea he was about to witness one of the most brilliant legal arguments ever presented by a non-attorney. The courtroom fell silent as the Hollywood star, known for his humble demeanor and roles in blockbuster films, stood his ground against one of the most notoriously strict judges in California. What happened next left everyone in the courtroom speechless. Comment where you're watching from today. The prestigious Los Angeles Superior Court building stood tall and imposing against the clear blue California sky. Its marble columns and grand entrance exuded authority and permanence, a temple of justice where the powerful and the ordinary alike stood equal before the law, or at least that was the ideal. Inside courtroom 217, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dancing dust particles and golden shafts of light. Polished wood panels lined the walls, and the American flag stood proudly next to the California state flag behind the judge's bench. The room smelled of lemon-scented polish, legal tomes, and anxiety. Judge Raymond Hoffman presided over his domain with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and little patience for celebrities who thought their fame would earn them special treatment. In his 30 years on the bench, he had seen it all, or so he thought. His silver hair, perpetual frown, and piercing blue eyes had intimidated countless attorneys. The legal community had nicknamed him the Hammer for his tendency to come down hard on those who wasted the court's time. Among those waiting their turn that morning was a man few in the courtroom immediately recognized. Dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit, he sat quietly in the back row. His posture was relaxed but attentive, his long hair tucked neatly behind his ears. No entourage surrounded him, no flashy watch adorned his wrist, no designer logos announced his worth. Keanu Reeves had arrived alone, carrying only a worn leather messenger bag containing documents related to his case, a dispute over a small property he owned in the Hollywood Hills that had become entangled in a zoning conflict with a powerful real estate developer. The developer, Maxwell Granite, sat across the aisle with his team of 3 attorneys in expensive suits, their leather briefcases emblazoned with the gold emblem of one of Los Angeles's most prestigious law firms. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing at Keanu with barely concealed smirks. They had been surprised, and secretly delighted, when they discovered the actor had chosen to represent himself rather than hire legal counsel. Case number 47,293, Granite Development Corporation versus Reeves, announced the court clerk, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Keanu rose with a calm confidence that made several heads turn. He approached the plaintiff's table with measured steps, setting down his messenger bag and organizing his documents with methodical precision. Across from him, the developer's legal team arranged themselves like chess pieces, ready for what they anticipated would be an easy victory. Judge Hoffman glanced down at the case file, then looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the defendant. His lips curled into a subtle but unmistakable expression of amusement. "Mr. Reeves," the judge's voice carried a note of condescension, "I see you've elected to represent yourself in this matter. Are you aware of the old adage that a man who represents himself has a fool for a client?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Maxwell Granite didn't bother to hide his smile. "I'm familiar with the saying, Your Honor," Keanu replied, his voice steady and respectful. "I'm also familiar with the details of my case." Judge Hoffman leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "This is not a movie set, Mr. Reeves. This is a court of law. The script has already been written. It's called the Legal Code of California, and I'm afraid you can't improvise your way through it." More laughter followed, louder this time. Even the court reporter couldn't suppress a smile. The judge was playing to his audience, establishing dominance in his domain. "I understand, Your Honor," Keanu said, unfazed by the mockery. "I've spent the past 3 months studying California property law and the specific zoning regulations relevant to this case." The judge raised an eyebrow. 3 months? Mr. Granite's attorneys have decades of combined experience, but by all means, proceed. Let's hear what you've learned in your crash course. Granite's lead attorney, Victoria Walsh, stood up. Her reputation for ruthless efficiency matched Judge Hoffman's. "Your Honor, we believe this is a straightforward case. Mr. Reeves' property falls under the new C3 zoning classification approved last year, which means our client's development project has precedence under Municipal Code Section 451.2. She proceeded to outline a compelling argument about economic development, job creation, and the technical details of the recent rezoning measure. Her presentation was polished, confident, and backed by numerous citations of legal precedents. As she spoke, she occasionally glanced at Keanu with barely concealed pity. When she finished, Judge Hoffman nodded approvingly. "Thank you, counselor." He turned to Keanu. "Your response, Mr. Reeves?" The courtroom grew quiet. Several spectators leaned forward, curious to see how the actor would respond to Walsh's methodical dismantling of his position. Some were already feeling embarrassed for him, anticipating a fumbling, inadequate response. Keanu stood, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath. When he began to speak, his voice was calm, measured, and unexpectedly authoritative. "Your Honor, while Ms. Walsh's argument is compelling, it relies on a fundamental misinterpretation of how the C3 zoning classification applies to historical properties." He opened his messenger bag and removed a document that appeared to be at least 50 years old. This is the original deed to the property, which contains a historical preservation covenant from 1972 that was registered with both the County Recorder's Office and the State Historical Society. Judge Hoffman's smirk faltered slightly. "Approach the bench, Mr. Reeves." Keanu walked forward and handed the document to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Hoffman studied it, his expression gradually shifting from amusement to curiosity. "Furthermore," Keanu continued, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to the California Historic Resources Preservation Act, specifically Section 37.4, which explicitly states that historical covenants registered prior to 1980 supersede subsequent zoning changes unless specifically addressed in the new zoning legislation." The judge's eyes narrowed. "And was this addressed in the new C3 classification?" "It was not, Your Honor," Keanu replied, producing another document from his bag. "This is the complete text of the rezoning measure passed last year. There is no mention of how historical covenants should be treated, and according to the precedent established in Historical Society of Pasadena versus City of Pasadena, 1997, such silence means the historical covenant remains in full effect." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hoffman was no longer smiling. Maxwell Granite leaned forward and whispered urgently to his legal team. Victoria Walsh's expression remained professional, but a new tension had appeared in her posture. "Ms. Walsh," the judge turned to the attorney, "were you aware of this historical covenant?" The attorney hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty from the normally unflappable lawyer. "We were aware of an older deed restriction, Your Honor, but our research indicated it had been superseded by subsequent property transfers." "That's a common misconception," Keanu interjected respectfully. "If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to cite Jenkins versus Oakland Township, 2004, which established that historical covenants run with the land and are not invalidated by property transfers unless explicitly addressed in the transfer documents." Judge Hoffman's face had now completely transformed from mocking amusement to intense focus. He was looking at Keanu with new eyes, reassessing the man who stood before him, not as a celebrity playing at being a lawyer, but as someone who had clearly done his homework. "It seems," the judge said slowly, "that there are aspects of this case that merit further examination." He turned to Granite's legal team. "Counselor Walsh, do you have a response to Mr. Reeves's citations?" The courtroom held its collective breath. The power dynamic had shifted palpably, and everyone could feel it. The actor who had been mocked just minutes before had revealed an unexpected depth of legal knowledge that had caught both the court and his opponents off guard. And as Judge Hoffman waited for Walsh's response, one thing became clear to everyone present. Underestimating Keanu Reeves had been a serious mistake. Victoria Walsh cleared her throat, buying precious seconds to gather her thoughts. The confident attorney who had strode into court that morning, expecting an easy victory, was now frantically reassessing her strategy. She glanced at her legal team, noting their concerned expressions as they hastily flipped through documents. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "While Mr. Reeves has raised an interesting point regarding historical covenants, We maintain that the economic development provisions in the new zoning laws were specifically designed to address outdated restrictions that impede urban renewal. Keanu nodded respectfully at her response before countering, "That may be the intent, Ms. Walsh, but as established in Sierra Club versus County of Los Angeles, 2010, intent must be explicitly codified to override existing historical protections." As he spoke, Keanu pulled out a dog-eared copy of the California Environmental Quality Act, tabs marking specific sections. The courtroom watched in fascination as the actor navigated complex legal territory with unexpected precision. Judge Hoffman's demeanor had transformed completely. The condescension had vanished, replaced by growing respect as he leaned forward, genuinely interested in the legal debate unfolding before him. The judge who had laughed just minutes ago now studied Keanu with intensifying curiosity. "Mr. Reeves," Judge Hoffman said, "you mentioned the Sierra Club case. Are you also familiar with the subsequent limitations placed on that ruling by the Ninth Circuit? It was a test question, the kind judges often use to probe the depth of someone's legal knowledge. Many experienced attorneys would struggle with such a specific inquiry." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. In Pacific Development Trust versus Sierra Club 2013, the Ninth Circuit established a three-pronged test for determining when economic interests can override historical covenants." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "However, that test specifically requires community impact studies, environmental assessments, and proof of significant public benefit, none of which have been conducted for this particular development." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maxwell Granite leaned forward and whispered urgently to his legal team. Their concerned expressions told the whole story. They had severely underestimated their opponent. Judge Hoffman nodded, impressed despite himself. "And what about the Wilshire Boulevard precedent from 2018? Surely that bears on this case." This was an even more obscure reference, a local case that had received little attention outside specialized legal circles. "The Wilshire case is indeed relevant, Your Honor," Keanu replied, pulling out another document from his messenger bag. "However, that ruling hinged on the property's location within a designated economic opportunity zone, which my property is not. Additionally, the historical covenant in the Wilshire case dated from 1985, placing it outside the protection of the pre-1980 provision I cited earlier." The judge sat back in his chair, his expression now one of genuine respect. The transformation was complete, from mockery to admiration, in less than 30 minutes. Maxwell Granite could remain silent no longer. The powerful developer stood up, his face flushed with frustration. "This is absurd. We've invested millions based on the city's assurance that this area was cleared for development. We can't let some actor's hobby house block progress because of some ancient paperwork." "Mr. Granite," Judge Hoffman's voice cracked like a whip, "you will be seated, and you will show respect for these proceedings. Your attorneys may speak on your behalf, or you may wait outside my courtroom. Those are your only options." Granite reluctantly sat down, glaring at Keanu, who maintained his composed demeanor. Victoria Walsh attempted to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, Mr. Reeves's arguments, while impressively researched, don't address the practical reality. This development project will create hundreds of jobs and significantly increase the tax base for the community." "I'm not disputing the potential benefits of the project, Ms. Walsh," Keanu responded. "My issue is specifically with the portion that would require demolishing a building that has significant historical and cultural value to the community. The structure was designed by Paul Williams, one of the first prominent African-American architects in Los Angeles, and served as a community center during a pivotal time in the city's history." He produced several photographs, which he handed to the clerk. These show the building in the 1940s and 50s, when it served as a meeting place for civil rights activists. The historical covenant was specifically created to preserve this legacy. Judge Hoffman examined the photographs with interest. This context certainly adds another dimension to the case. "Furthermore," Keanu continued, "I've developed an alternative proposal that would allow Mr. Granite to proceed with 95% of his development while preserving the historical structure." He pulled out a set of architectural drawings. "I've consulted with urban planners who believe this approach would actually enhance the value of the overall project by incorporating a unique historical element that could become a cultural draw." The judge raised an eyebrow. You've gone to considerable lengths, Mr. Reeves. I believe in being thorough, Your Honor, Keanu replied simply, and in finding solutions that respect both progress and preservation. Victoria Walsh tried another approach. Your Honor, regardless of Mr. Reeves's admirable research, the fact remains that our client has already secured permits from the City Planning Commission based on the current zoning. That's a valid point, Judge Hoffman acknowledged. Mr. Reeves, how do you respond? The permits were granted without proper consideration of the historical covenant, which constitutes a procedural error, Keanu explained. In Martinez v. City Council of San Diego, 2005, the California Supreme Court established that permits issued in contravention of existing legal restrictions are void ab initio, invalid from the beginning. Judge Hoffman nodded slowly. Ms. Walsh, did the Planning Commission address the historical covenant when issuing these permits? The attorney hesitated. I would need to verify that specific detail, Your Honor. I have the complete permit application here, Keanu said, producing another document. There's no mention of the historical covenant anywhere in the submission or the approval documents. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. The spectators, court staff, and even the attorneys for the opposing side were witnessing something extraordinary. A non-lawyer, not only holding his own in complex legal proceedings, but potentially winning against one of the city's most powerful developers and his elite legal team. Judge Hoffman studied Keanu for a long moment, the last traces of his earlier amusement long gone. In its place was a growing respect for the unexpected legal mind that had emerged before him. The case that had seemed so straightforward that morning had revealed layers of complexity that demanded serious consideration. I believe, the judge said finally, that this matter warrants more thorough examination than I initially anticipated. Judge Hoffman leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. In light of the complexity of this case, I'm ordering a 30-minute recess. Ms. Walsh, I suggest you and your team review Mr. Reeves's historical covenant documents thoroughly. We'll reconvene at 11 o'clock. As the judge rose, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Legal interns rushed to their phones in the hallway, texting colleagues about the unexpected showdown they were witnessing. Reporters who had come for what they thought would be a routine celebrity appearance in court were now frantically taking notes, sensing a much bigger story unfolding. Maxwell Granite cornered his legal team in a side conference room, his face flushed with anger. How did you miss this? We're paying you thousands of dollars an hour, and you're being outmaneuvered by an actor? Victoria Walsh maintained her professional composure. Mr. Granite, we're dealing with an unusual situation. Mr. Reeves has clearly invested significant time preparing for this case. Fix it, Granite hissed. Whatever it takes. That property is the cornerstone of the entire development. Without it, we lose the ocean view for the luxury units, which drops our projected revenue by $20 million. Meanwhile, Keanu sat alone at the defendant's table, calmly reviewing his notes. Several people approached to express their admiration for his performance, but he responded with humble nods and quiet thanks. Unlike Granite, who projected power through intimidation, Keanu carried himself with a centered confidence that required no external validation. A young law student who had been observing the proceedings worked up the courage to approach him. Mr. Reeves, she said hesitantly, I'm studying property law at UCLA. Your citations were incredibly precise. How did you prepare for this? Keanu looked up with a gentle smile. I believe that if something's worth fighting for, it's worth understanding completely. This building isn't just property to me. It's part of the city's cultural heritage. Before they could continue their conversation, the bailiff called the court back into session. Judge Hoffman returned to the bench, his earlier amusement completely replaced by judicial seriousness. Ms. Walsh, have you had sufficient time to review the materials presented by Mr. Reeves? Victoria Walsh stood, projecting confidence despite the challenging position she found herself in. Yes, Your Honor. While we acknowledge the existence of the historical covenant, we maintain that the city's recent Economic Revitalization Act creates a statutory exception under California Code Section 835.7, which allows for modification of historical designations in cases of compelling public interest. It was a strong counterargument, one that might have worked against a less prepared opponent. Keanu nodded respectfully before rising to respond. Ms. Walsh raises an important point about Section 835.7, he began, but that provision specifically includes a grandfather clause protecting covenants that are registered with both local and state historical societies. He produced yet another document from his seemingly bottomless messenger bag. This is the confirmation of dual registration from 1972, signed by then-Governor Ronald Reagan as part of his Historical Preservation Initiative. Judge Hoffman examined the document, his eyebrows rising slightly. This appears to be in order, Ms. Walsh. The grandfather clause would indeed apply in this case. Victoria Walsh conferred quickly with her team before trying another angle. Your Honor, even with the historical designation, there's a balancing test required between preservation and economic development. The City Council has already determined that this project meets the threshold for exceptional economic benefit. That's factually correct, Keanu acknowledged, surprising everyone with his concession. However, the law requires that alternative solutions be thoroughly explored before historical structures can be compromised. He lifted the architectural plans he had presented earlier. My proposal demonstrates that with minor modifications to the original development plan, both goals can be achieved. The historical building can be incorporated as a centerpiece of the development, preserving history while enhancing the project's unique appeal. Judge Hoffman studied the architectural renderings with interest. This does appear to be a thoughtful compromise, Mr. Reeves. Ms. Walsh, has your client considered such alternatives? Victoria Walsh shifted uncomfortably. Our client has evaluated numerous configurations, Your Honor, and determined that the current plan represents the optimal use of the space. Optimal for profit margins, Keanu noted quietly, but perhaps not optimal for community benefit or historical preservation. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Reeves raises a valid point. The law does indeed require good faith exploration of alternatives before historical structures can be modified or demolished. Maxwell Granite could contain himself no longer. He rose to his feet, ignoring his attorney's attempt to restrain him. This is preposterous. We've spent millions on planning, permits, and preparations. Delays cost money, Your Honor. So does litigation, Mr. Granite, Judge Hoffman replied coolly, and I remind you again to address the court only through your counsel. Granite subsided, his frustration palpable. Victoria Walsh attempted to recover the situation. Your Honor, while Mr. Reeves' alternative is creative, our client has contractual obligations with investors that require adherence to the approved timeline and specifications. Private contractual obligations do not supersede public law, Counselor, Judge Hoffman replied. That principle was established in Commonwealth Properties v. Sacramento County, 2009. Keanu nodded in agreement. Additionally, Your Honor, I'd like to introduce community impact statements from local historical societies, neighborhood associations, and cultural preservation groups. He handed a thick folder to the clerk. These organizations all support the preservation of the historical structure and have expressed willingness to contribute to its restoration as part of an integrated development plan. Judge Hoffman flipped through the statements, clearly impressed by the thoroughness of Keanu's preparation. You've been quite busy, Mr. Reeves. I believe in being thorough, Your Honor, Keanu replied simply, and in finding solutions that benefit everyone involved. The judge studied him for a long moment. It seems you do. He turned to Walsh. Counselor, your client has two options at this point. You can agree to explore Mr. Reeves's alternative proposal in good faith, or we can proceed to a full hearing where I will rule on the validity of the historical covenant and its legal precedence over the current development permits. Victoria Walsh conferred briefly with Granite, whose angry gestures were visible to everyone in the courtroom. Finally, she turned back to the judge. We request a brief adjournment to discuss these options with our client, Your Honor. Granted, Judge Hoffman nodded. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. And Mr. Granite, he added, fixing the developer with a stern gaze, I strongly suggest you consider Mr. Reeves's compromise. It appears to offer a reasonable solution that respects both your business interests and the community's historical heritage. As the courtroom began to clear for the adjournment, Judge Hoffman beckoned Keanu to approach the bench. The actor stepped forward, curious. Mr. Reeves, the the judge said quietly when the others were out of earshot. "I owe you an apology for my initial skepticism. It's not often I'm so thoroughly impressed in my courtroom, especially by someone without formal legal training." Keanu nodded modestly. "Thank you, Your Honor. I've always believed that respect must be earned, not demanded. I didn't take offense." Judge Hoffman smiled slightly. "Well, you've certainly earned mine today. Whatever happens next, you've already won a significant victory for historical preservation in this city." When court reconvened an hour later, the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. News of the morning's proceedings had spread through the legal community. The once half-empty courtroom was now packed with spectators, including law students, local preservationists, and even a few recognizable faces from Hollywood who had come to support their colleague. Maxwell Granite and his legal team entered with grim expressions. The developer's earlier arrogance had visibly diminished, replaced by a calculating businessman's pragmatism. Victoria Walsh approached the bench with a document in hand, her professional composure intact despite the morning's setbacks. "Your Honor," she began, "after careful consideration, my client is prepared to explore Mr. Reeves's alternative proposal under certain conditions." She handed the document to the clerk. "We've outlined our requirements for such an agreement." Judge Hoffman reviewed the document briefly before passing it to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, please take a moment to review this." Keanu studied the document carefully, his expression revealing nothing. The courtroom waited in tense silence. After several minutes, he looked up. "Your Honor, while I appreciate Mr. Granite's willingness to consider alternatives, these conditions effectively nullify the historical protections we've been discussing." He pointed to specific sections of the document. These clauses would give the developer unilateral authority to modify the historical structure based on subjective feasibility assessments. That undermines the very purpose of the historical covenant. Judge Hoffman frowned. "Ms. Walsh, your client appears to be offering a compromise that isn't actually a compromise." "Your Honor," Walsh countered, "the development timeline and budget constraints make full preservation extremely challenging. We're simply acknowledging those realities in our conditions." Keanu reached into his messenger bag one more time and produced a slim binder. "If I may, Your Honor, I anticipated this concern. This contains a detailed preservation and integration plan developed in consultation with historical architects who specialize in incorporating protected structures into modern developments. It includes timeline adjustments that would add only 45 days to the project and budget estimates that show the long-term value added by preserving the historical elements." As he handed the binder to the clerk, a murmur of appreciation rippled through the courtroom. Even some members of Granite's legal team exchanged impressed glances. Judge Hoffman took his time reviewing the new materials, occasionally nodding as he turned the pages. Finally, he looked up. "This is remarkably thorough, Mr. Reeves. You've anticipated virtually every practical objection and provided workable solutions." He turned to Walsh. "Counselor, your client's concerns appear to have been addressed in detail." Walsh conferred briefly with Granite, whose expression had darkened considerably. When she turned back to the judge, her professional demeanor showed signs of strain. "Your Honor, while Mr. Reeves' proposal is creative, my client maintains that his original development plan represents the best use of the property. We're prepared to litigate this matter fully, if necessary." A tense silence fell over the courtroom. Everyone present understood the implied threat. A wealthy developer with unlimited legal resources could drag out proceedings for years, potentially bankrupting anyone who stood in his way. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before. Judge Hoffman's expression hardened. "Ms. Walsh, let me be absolutely clear. Based on the evidence presented today, I find substantial merit in Mr. Reeves's position regarding the historical covenant. Should your client choose to pursue protracted litigation, this court would be compelled to issue an immediate injunction halting all development activities while the case proceeds, which could take years, not weeks or months." Granite's face flushed with anger. He whispered furiously to Walsh, who listened with a resigned expression before addressing the court again. "Your Honor, in light of your statement, my client would like to request a brief recess to reconsider his position." "Granted, 20 minutes." The judge's tone left no room for negotiation. As the court emptied for the second time that day, Keanu remained at his table, quietly organizing his materials. Unlike Granite and his team, who huddled in intense discussion in the hallway, the actor appeared perfectly at ease, a man comfortable with whatever outcome might follow. One of the court clerks approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Reeves, I've been working in this courtroom for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone represent themselves so effectively against Walsh and her team. It's remarkable." Keanu smiled warmly. "Thank you, but I had good teachers. I spent time with community legal aid attorneys who fight these battles every day without recognition. They helped me understand not just the law, but why it matters." When court resumed, Victoria Walsh approached the bench with Maxwell Granite by her side. The developer's demeanor had changed completely, the anger replaced by resigned calculation. "Your Honor," Walsh began, "my client has reconsidered his position and is prepared to accept Mr. Reeves's alternative development plan with minor modifications to be negotiated in good faith." A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the courtroom. Judge Hoffman nodded approvingly. "A wise decision, Mr. Granite. I believe this outcome will benefit all parties, including the community." He turned to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, are you amenable to good faith negotiations regarding the implementation details?" "Absolutely, Your Honor," Keanu replied. "My goal has always been to find a solution that respects both progress and preservation." "Excellent." The judge smiled for the first time that day. "I'll retain jurisdiction over this matter to ensure the agreement is implemented as negotiated. The parties will report back in 30 days with a finalized integration plan." He paused, looking directly at Keanu. "And Mr. Reeves, should you ever tire of your current profession, the legal community would clearly benefit from your presence." As the courtroom began to clear, Maxwell Granite approached Keanu, offering his hand with newfound respect. "You could have simply sold the property to us for a substantial profit," he said, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Why go through all this?" "Some things are worth more than money, Mr. Granite," Keanu replied, accepting the handshake. "That building was a gathering place for people who changed this city for the better. Their story deserves to be remembered." Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters had gathered, alerted to the unusual proceedings. As Keanu emerged, they called out questions about his unexpected legal prowess. "I'm not a lawyer," he responded with characteristic humility. "I'm just someone who cares about preserving our shared history." A young reporter pressed further. "But how did you manage to outmaneuver one of the city's top legal teams?" Keanu paused, considering the question. "I think people often confuse credentials with capability and fame with substance. The legal system exists to protect all of us, not just those who can afford the most expensive representation. When we take the time to truly understand the rules that govern our society, we can all ensure justice is served." As Keanu departed, walking alone down the courthouse steps, Judge Hoffman watched from a window above. The judge who had laughed at the actor just hours before now nodded with profound respect. In his 30 years on the bench, he had seen thousands of attorneys argue before him, but rarely had he witnessed such a perfect combination of preparation, principle, and purpose. The case that began with mockery had transformed into something none had expected, a masterclass in citizen advocacy, and a powerful reminder that true wisdom often comes from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes, the person dismissed as merely a famous face might just possess the most brilliant mind in the room.